Hi, sweet souls. This is Krista Ziomata, host of I'm Awake Now What podcast. I am doing this summer series for several reasons, but before I get into all of those reasons, I did want to acknowledge that we are in the middle of a global pandemic. It's June 3rd, and I'm recording this first summer series episode also in the wake of a revolution against systemic racism in America. And I didn't want to start out without acknowledging that that's happening right now. Um, my inception for the summer series started a couple months ago. As you know, if you follow the podcast closely, I do always take a summer break. And instead of taking a summer break, I decided that I would provide everybody with a free educational resource related to religious trauma and religious wounding and inner healing, because I've never created a completely consolidated place for my own specific journey, and I'm hoping that it will be a resource to many people who are in the midst of also trying to figure this out for themselves, like I had to. But before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge what was going on in our society, and just remind everybody who is on the spiritual path that part of our responsibility as spiritual healers and part of us being responsible adults is also being awakened and enlightened to the injustices and inequities of our world, and caring for the people around us as we care for ourselves. That's what I'd like to say about that, and we'll get into this summer series. I'm super excited about this because I've had lots of people message me since I started the podcast about their experiences from leaving their religion of origin, and also not having religion and delving into spirituality and trying to figure out how to navigate that. And the intention of my podcast was that once I had gotten on the other side of my own journey through leaving my religion, finding what I believed, instilling my own deep inner wisdom and truth and living by it every day, that I would find a way to create space for people who are on the spiritual journey and figuring things out. I'd start this podcast so that you could have resources, people, information, experiences of other people to shape your own new narrative for yourself and what it means to be a spiritual person in 2020. So with that said, I've spoken a lot of times on the podcast about my religious experience, and I haven't really gone into such a level of detail that I'm going to in this 8-week series. And the goal and purpose, we'll talk about in just a second, but it's really just to consolidate the experience, to have anyone who's gone through a similar experience, that they can see themselves in the reflection of my experiences and know that they're not alone, and that I'm here to help you guys. So what is going to happen in these next 8 weeks? I just want to open up with talking about what we're going to be doing the next 8 weeks. So the weekly schedule is such that we're going to dive into religious trauma and wounding for week 1. Week 2, we're going to do doubt and walking away. Week 3, we're going to be doing embracing uncertainty and inner healing. Week 5, we're going to touch on awakening. Week 6, finding your truth. Week 7, building support systems. Week 8, coming home to yourself. Again, it's a summer series. It's running for 8 weeks. It's 1 free hour podcast course dedicated to all of my listeners and anyone else who needs help with this very specific subject, from July 5th until August 23rd, 2020. And the slide deck that you're viewing right now will be uploaded onto the podcast YouTube page so that you can see that. It will also be embedded with all of my podcast websites. And then this podcast episode will air on the podcast on all podcast platforms. So you'll be able to find this whole series if you're subscribed to the podcast, and please make sure you stay subscribed on Spotify, Google Play, Libsyn, and Apple Podcasts. Okay, so a quick introduction to the summer series. The purpose and intention is to provide a safe space for individuals to explore, create, and release belief systems. The mission and vision is to usher in a global expansion of our communities through open dialogue, spirituality, reflection, inner healing, and self-love. And because we'll be dealing with really sensitive subjects and a lot of information that I'm going to be sharing with you could be triggering, I want to just set this disclaimer out for anybody participating in the summer course. So all individuals engaging and or participating in any portion of this course are encouraged to seek professional help and any other supplemental mental health assistance they might require. The topics covered in this course are sensitive and there is a possibility of becoming triggered. I'm Awake Now What podcast is not responsible for any trauma incurred while completing this course. Mental health resources are provided after each weekly course and available on all platforms wherever this course is distributed. So what can you expect every week as you join me here? So what I thought I would structure each weekly episode with is a curated topic, some storytelling related to my specific experience, reflections and journaling to give you the opportunity to absorb everything I've said and check for your own understanding if there have been similar situations in your life that you want to unpack, and then create some journaling prompts for you to journal with. I also have reading recommendations, and because the podcast has been primarily focused on spirituality and leaving one's religion of origin, there are a lot of podcasts that will apply to each subject that we're covering every week. So I'm going to go ahead and pop in some podcast episodes for you to listen to if you haven't listened to them yet, and provide any additional resources. And you are highly encouraged to engage with me via email or DM me with your thoughts, and just let me know what's going on with you, because I'm here for you and I'm here to support you in this journey, because I didn't have anybody. So I'm here as your luminary and as your alkalite to help you walk through this place of understanding and freedom and liberation and self-love and forgiveness and healing. And I am just here to help you usher in that next place you need to get to. Okay, so week one. I will apologize to you in advance. My dog could possibly bark during this podcast episode. So it is what it is. We'll just deal with it as it comes. So week one, religious trauma and religious wounding. I did want to actually go ahead and define both of these things to you and then talk to you about RTS. So just walking through these definitions really quickly. Religious trauma is a function of both the chronic abuses of a harmful religious experience and the impact of severing one's connection with one's faith and faith community. Religious wounding is deep wounding and mental or physical damage caused by religion. RTS, also known as religious trauma syndrome, is when trauma and wounding have occurred in a person because of a harmful religious experience or the separation from a religious faith or community that has caused long-term psychological damage, and this can be mentally, physically, or emotionally. So maybe you've never heard these terms before. Maybe you don't know that they're actually classified as a psychological indication for your own mental health. I really wanted to bring this to your awareness that if you experienced religious trauma through your religious experience, and whether that was, being forced to be part of a religious experience, or you had actual sexual abuse in a religious organization, or you had religious wounding because you left your religion of origin and you were ostracized, or I know some religions refer to it as, you're just like a pariah and you're not welcome. And, you have kind of a scorn of sorts on yourself. So that's really traumatizing. And I want to recognize the trauma that you've endured in this moment, and I want you to be able to recognize it and take it in and really honor that what you feel and what you have felt and what you've gone through is real, and there's an actual diagnosis for it in regards to your own mental health. And so I hope that brings you a bit of peace on this journey. So we're going to go bit by bit through religious trauma and wounding, and I want to talk about my experience. So this is where the storytelling is going to come in for me. I always talk about on the podcast that I grew up Catholic, and I grew up, it's my dog. I grew up in an off-brand sect of Catholicism that I often mention because it's important, because like many religions, Catholicism it's one religion, but can be broken into a myriad of things depending on the people who are running it and the intentions. And you find this in all different religions. There's lots of other Judeo-Christian religions that have different versions or nuanced versions of their own religion. So for me, that's how I grew up. I grew up in a off-brand shoot of Catholicism ran by a fundamentalist priest who had a different vision for what he wanted people's religious experience with Catholicism to be. And as an adult, I've spent most of my late adulthood, I shouldn't say, not that I'm old, but my late 20s and most of my 30s speaking out about this because it wounded me. And it was the catalyst to a lot of my decisions that were not my own that led to a lot of suffering. And then it was the catalyst that led me to my own liberation. So in a sense, it was the best and worst thing that could have ever happened to me. So we'll go into depth on all of those things through each week. But specifically in my experience, and I want to say that there are more things here for you to discover on your own. So when you think about religious trauma, I'm going to list out my traumas, and I'm going to ask you and encourage you to look back on your experience. And if what you experience is not on this list, please start to compile a list of things that hurt you so that you can put a name to them and that you can work your way backwards to find the resources in which require healing. And I also want to acknowledge that I did not endure sexual abuse during my Catholic upbringing, and that was not part of my religious wounding or trauma, but that is a very common experience in a lot of people's religious trauma and religious wounding. And I will help you find whatever resources you need if that's what you're dealing with specifically too. So again, don't be shy and slide into those DMs and shoot me an email. So the biggest one, or the biggest issues of my religious trauma are all listed here: brainwashing, groupthink and herd mentality, forced religious participation, predefined identity, teaching hate and fear, abstinence, and duality. So going one by one on each of those things, brainwashing was the psychological weapon of choice and in my religious experience, because not only did we have to memorize religious scripture, there was indirect and direct messages about how one comported themselves, how they interacted with other people, and it was like this incestuous swirl of brainwashing that happened all the time. So you were always engrossed and circulating in this continuous brainwashing and interpretation of the religious text of the Bible. And that was really, really traumatizing, because when you're brainwashed at an early age, and most religions know that the sooner and the earlier you can get children involved in religion in their formidable years, the more likely they are to stay in it and never leave. So there's this literal psychological battle happening if you're young. And so the brainwashing also meant that you don't think for yourself, because you're thinking kind of like everybody else, which we'll get into the next one, with the groupthink and herd mentality. But I just want to give you a quick example of the brainwashing that was endured during my religious experience. The brainwashing that sticks out to the most to me is not only the religious script that we had to recite over and over and over. I could blurt out Psalm 91 right now if I wanted to. It is forever in my brain. It will never go away, because I was forced to recite it in front of an abortion clinic when I was a child for many years. But there was also the brainwashing of to keep people in a line, in line. So there was always cautionary tales. The brainwashing also involved a lot of fear mongering. So it was like, you know, if somebody had come into the organization and decided that it wasn't for them, or somebody ended up pregnant, or somebody had a sexual experience they weren't supposed to have because they weren't married, they became a cautionary tale. And that cautionary tale usually involved some sort of form of punishment from God. They lost their job. Oh no, you can't be like them. Things like this. And it's terrible. So brainwashing is real in religious experience, and that's how they keep you entrapped. And that's how I stayed entrapped for a really long time. And you feel, and you are felt, or you are not felt, excuse me, you are meant to feel like you can never question. So the brainwashing involves suppressing your own cognitive ability and your own interpersonal dynamics in your brain that allow you to have curiosity. I had to relearn how to think once I left, because I had stopped thinking for myself, essentially. And the groupthink and the herd mentality, again, in religious organizations, they're really good about making people feel like they belong and that they're a community and things like that. And sometimes that can be bad, because people who have no family, or are in situations where they're not having a lot of connection, can get really drawn into these situations where their only connection is their community of religion. And if that religious community is not being ran ethically and with integrity, because there are a lot of religious organizations that are being ran with integrity and with a core set of ethics and transparency. But if those things are missing, it makes it almost easy just to slip into that religious experience and go with the flow and feel like you belong. And there's always this like exuberant, honeymoon phase when you come into a new community and you're the new person and you're meeting everybody, and everything is shiny and bright and new. And then as time goes on, you start to see sort of the cracks in the armor of the religion with the people that are there. If you're in a space that is not transparent, not living up to the ideals of the Christian texts that they are trying to imbue. So the other, I would say the next big thing for me was forced religious participation. I want to say two things here, is that I was forced into religious participation, doing things that now as an adult make me want to scream and make me want to I'm ashamed that I was put in this position to do these things. But I was a child, and I was at the mercy of my parents, who said I had to do these things, and who oftentimes weren't there while I was forced to do these religious participations. And it's wrong. I don't have a child yet, but I think to myself, there's no way I would ever put my child in the situations I was put in as a child. And in my interview with Misty Diane, she is a spiritual activist and she's awesome. She's on the list of episodes that you should listen to after um, this podcast episode. The second thing I wanted to say was that she talks about religion in the sense of geography. And so for me, that was true. So what Misty says is that, 99% of us are forced into religion because of the geography, the location of where we live. And that was 150% true for me. I was adopted into a family that lived in El Paso, Texas, and we're a Hispanic family. The core religion of Hispanics is Catholicism. So there was almost no chance that I wasn't going to be Catholic or put into a Catholic organization at some point in my life. So when I think about the healing and the forgiveness and the work that I've needed to do to let go of my anger and resentment and the shame and all of those things, which we'll touch on when we go into the inner healing component of this 8-week series, is that it's important to keep in your mind that if you had been born anywhere else, you would have been something different or no religion at all. So the specific religious participation I'm talking about that really breaks my heart even today is as a child, I was forced to protest at abortion clinics and at Democratic conventions. I was forced to protest and humiliate essentially physicians who were participating in abortion and facilitating abortions for people in El Paso. And this is not the place to have the conversation about the abortion debate, and I'm not going to even dive into that. But what I want to dive into is that what I know now as an adult is that in these forced religious protests and participations is I was forced to humiliate the life of somebody who I didn't know, who was part of their own community, who had children, who had neighbors that didn't know what they did, and they were ostracized by my church community, and that's shameful and wrong. The other thing is, in that same protest, we were often told that we had to go and protest at abortion clinics and, yell at the women walking into the abortion clinics who, if you're walking into an abortion clinic, it's not something you're probably doing lightly, and you've spent a lot of time trying to understand why you've come to that decision. And so to publicly shame women from the outside of an abortion clinic as a child breaks my heart. And I was forced to do it. I didn't have a decision to do it. And there were multiple different protests. And like I said, we were forced to go to Democratic conventions. And the other trauma was we used to carry around little fetuses in bottles in formaldehyde. And that was super traumatizing. And I couldn't tell my mom and I couldn't tell my dad that it scared me and that it was gross and I didn't want to see it because I was a child and I was just told to fall in line. And that's trauma and that's wounding and that's painful. And I still can't talk to my parents about it till this day. So the other thing is we used to have to carry these picket signs around, and the picket signs would have an aborted baby on it. And the image of that was meant to invoke some response from the people walking into the clinic because it was so gruesome. But what I don't think that, and maybe they did, I don't know what they were thinking, but the priest and the church elders that ran our organization never even thought once of what that image for us young kids having to look at it, what it meant for us and how traumatizing it was, how disturbing it was to see that. Like we were little kids, and we didn't need to see that, and we didn't deserve to see that. We didn't deserve to be participating in that. And then there were the arrests. I had to watch children get arrested. I was propped up against an abortion door and hauled off by police with another set of children when I was like, 9, 10, 11 years old. I had to watch my mom get arrested because she was blocking an abortion door. And we were never expected to express how scared we were. Like, I couldn't express how scared it was that my mom just went to jail, and how terrified I was and how scared I was as a child to try to process that. They didn't even give us space to process that. And that's traumatizing. And so I don't know if you yourself have gone through a forced religious experience, but they're real. And I know that they happen to a lot of people. And especially when you're a young child, you cannot say no to your parents. So I want you to give yourself some grace and let yourself feel, the angst and the resentment and the pain and whatever is coming up for you. Sometimes I just get really angry about it, to be quite honest. I get really super angry because I feel like it was so wrong to put children in that psychological position. And as an adult now, I have the hindsight of my own adulthood to think like, gosh, I would never, ever put my child in that kind of situation ever again. Or not ever again, but I would never do that to my child. And especially coming from being like a self-responsible adult, to me, it's like part of it is that you allow your children to grow up. You don't raise children to indoctrinate them. You raise children to be able to think for themselves. And if your child decides that they want to participate in that when they're older and they have the mind to do that, then great, let's bring them along. But don't force your children to do that, is kind of where I've shooken out as an adult. So I'm going to leave it there because I can say so much more, but I want you to think about your forced religious experiences. Were you dragged to church every Sunday? Were you forced to dress a certain way? Were you forced to think a certain way? Were you forced to hand out pamphlets? Were you forced to do a mission that you didn't want to go to, or to another country? Were you forced to ride a bike and try to convert and evangelize people that you didn't want to do but your family made you do? Every single religion I think I know on earth has some institutionalized forced religious participation that if you're young and you're not an adult, you are forced to participate in. So if you're Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, Muslim, Jewish, any religion, like, pause this podcast for just a second and write what were you forced into. The next religious trauma is predefined identity. So one thing that I've worked a lot on as an adult, and I talk a lot about it on the podcast, is this idea that the energy between masculine and feminine, and how that energy exists in all of us, and it's a spectrum, and it's kind of like the volume going up and down. On any given day, you're more in your masculine, you're more in your feminine, and it teeters all the time. But in a lot of Christian, and I would say in a lot of the Abrahamic religions, women have a predefined role and men have a predefined role. And this is damaging because you never get to explore the dichotomy of your masculine and feminine energy. And you're also told that if you were born a female or a male, you fit specifically in this little box as religion sees fit. And for me, the messages I received was that I was a woman, I was to submit to men, I was supposed to procreate and be a mother, and I had no other recourse to be anything but that. And on the men's side, it was that you were supposed to be strong and loyal to God and provide for your family at all costs necessary, and so that your wife could stay home and raise a gajillion children. So that doesn't leave a lot of room for self-exploration, self-identification, self-expression. I mean, there's nothing there for you to really work with. You're just in this little box, and it's not fair, because none of us in this world is just one thing. We're a complex creature and a complex species, and we're more than one thing, usually all at once, and at no time at all. So what for you, when you think about the predefined identity, what was a predefined identity that was imposed on you during your religious experience, and was that traumatizing for you? An interesting thing for me was, even though I grew up in a traditional family with a mom and a dad, my mom lived a lot in her masculine. She was like the predominant provider of our family, and lived in her masculine a lot. And I learned a lot about how to be ambitious, and how to work hard and have a career, and to get an education, and to put in 150% from that. But then when it came to her idea of the woman in religion, that looked very different. So there was always this contradiction, I think, that she continued to vacillate back and forth, and I always had a hard time reconciling watching her, and then subsequently had trouble reconciling within myself as an adult, early in my departure from the church. So that's how it manifested for me, and I want you to think about how predefined identity would have impacted you. The next one, I'm going to take a quick sip of water because I'm running out of steam in my throat for talking for an hour. Usually I get breaks because I've got guests who take up some of this airspace. So this is a new experience for all of us. The other trauma I felt was the teaching of hate and fear. Holy cow. I didn't recognize this until I was older and I was removed from it, and how that even though the Bible and the text and Jesus's life was really built around acceptance and tolerance, kindness and compassion, and self-sacrifice, those are the messages that were left from his life. But in my religious experience, those lessons were taught, but then there was this lesson of hate and fear that was tied all into those messages. So it was like we were taught to hate people that didn't believe what we believed, and of course, like every religion, we were indoctrinated to believe that we were the one right true religion, and that forevermore anyone that was not Catholic was going to end in their life in a fiery pit of hell. And that's a terrible way to go around the world, thinking that, if you're not part of this organization, then your soul is forever lost. And that's not what Jesus taught. So that was awful. And then there was the fear mongering of like, don't interact with people who aren't from this religion, or don't believe this, like they'll lead you astray, and they're wrong, or they're sinful. And teaching that hate and that fear, again, in the backdrop of Christ consciousness, it cancels it out. You can't have Christ consciousness and teach hate and fear. It just doesn't work that way. So as an adult, I've had to learn that there was that contradiction, and that contradiction undermines what they're trying to do. Again, this is specifically speaking to religions that are using these tactics, and not every religion is like this, not every church is like this, but this was my experience. And then the next one is abstinence. So when you think about abstinence, I think a lot of people just think sex, but like for my experience, it wasn't just sex. It was like, don't watch TV. I mean, our priest constantly said to throw out your televisions. It was abstaining from or abstaining from secular music, abstaining from food. Food was such a weird thing in our religious experience, and because of it, I've had, you know, my own battles with food, and it was like, you know, don't eat certain things, and um, then there was the sex piece as well, right? So the shame and the fear and the cautionary tales of like not exploring your own sexuality, and if you're in a relationship when you're young you can't have sex, and all of these things, and that really does a number on a young mind and a young body. And there's nothing shameful about our sexuality, there's nothing shameful about food, there's nothing shameful about television, there's nothing shameful about listening to music. So what I've seen in the abstinent piece is that there's this extremeness that exists in you when you're taught that that there has to be abstinence. And like for my unwinding and unpackaging of all of this meant that I had to like swing to the other extreme and then actually come back to center, which is a really painful experience to go through, because you know you're taught from the minute you get into your religious experience that this side, this right, which we'll talk about in the duality point right below abstinence, is this point of right, and everything on the opposite side of that is wrong, you know. And then you come to find out like, well, if I'm going to live not right the way my religious experience has taught me to, then I have to live on the other side of this extreme. I've had many people come to the podcast and many people DM me, many people have conversations with me who said I had to go all the way to the opposite end. And that's why we see people struggling with drugs and alcohol and sex addiction and things like, and cutting and wounding themselves because they're trying to make sense of the abstinence. Abstinence is not what anybody should be teaching. What we should be teaching is balance and equanimity in all things. And we should be teaching our children about their bodies, and not just their bodies in the sexual sense, but their bodies in how to actually nourish them with food and water in a way that is good and healthy and helps them sustain themselves and love themselves. So the abstinence thing was weird, for sure, in my upbringing. And the duality is that it's like right and wrong, black and white, us and them. That's what I heard growing up, indirectly, directly. We always had an enemy wherever we were. You know, the enemy was the Democrats, the enemy were the liberals, the enemy was people who were not Catholic. The devil was always out to get us. Like, I never saw him show up. He never came. The devil never came, but he was just always about to get us, you know. And it was this duality and this like otherness. I talk about this on the show sometimes too, and I definitely am talking about it in my book, The Alchemy of Kindness, this otherness of, and it's egoic. It's this egoic otherness that we're better than you and we're right and what we're doing is right and what we belong to is right and everything else is wrong. And that duality is terrible. And to wrap all these things together is the guilt. You know, I don't know anyone who's gone through a religious experience and hasn't been like smothered in guilt. I still struggle with guilt, and I've been 12 years removed from my religious experience. And there are there's the guilt of being lazy, the guilt of not doing enough, the guilt of, you know, I mean, everything, you name it. And so I encourage you to sit down with the things that make you, the things that you were taught, the way you were taught to abstain, the duality you felt, and the overarching like guilt in it all, because guilt is how, it's like guilt is like a verbal prison. It's how they keep you imprisoned in their ideologies and in their communities and in their way of thinking. So guilt is like having invisible handcuffs on, and you can't go anywhere, and you're on house arrest, and it's a real thing. I want you to know that this is such a real thing. What you experienced is real, and it's valid, and it deserves a voice, and it deserves to be seen and to be heard. And I'm here to tell you, like, I hear you and I see you. And I honor that you are here with me today. And I honor that you are taking this exploration with me, and that you want to understand how to unravel and unpack all of this trauma. And it is not easy. It's why we need professional help. I needed professional help to work through all of this. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. So those are my religious traumas, just going all down them. The wounding, which, you know, is so real. The religious wounding we carry around is really hard. And because a lot of us start in the religions, like I said, when we're really young, it's created all these neural pathways in our mind that keeps looping the thought back to us, like, I'm sinful, I had sex out of wedlock, I'm gonna, burn in hell, I shouldn't eat that thing, or I need to go to church, I need to ask for forgiveness. It's a literal firing of neurons and neural pathways in your mind, bringing you back to that trauma and that wounding over again. It takes a lot of time to unravel and unpack and heal from all these things. My religious wounding are broken down into these main categories for me. I felt a great deal of shame because of the sexual abstinence thing was so weird. And in my religion of origin, our priest had this like ranch that looked very similar to the Ranch Davidians of Waco. And there was a pool that he had built in this ranch. And if you were a girl, you had to wear your bathing suit, but over your bathing suit, you had to wear shorts and a big t-shirt. And the men and the boys could swim bare-chested in their trunks. So what were they telling me there? What was being said there? What was being said was that essentially my body is so lust-worthy, even if I'm a child, that I have to cover it up because I will drive men to sin. Mind you, there was never even a thought that women might be having a lustful thought over the men with their bare chests. And because we weren't thought of as sexual beings. We weren't allowed to be sexual beings. That shame was so deeply ingrained in me, and we were always taught to dress modestly, to not wear a lot of makeup, to not draw attention to ourselves. And that's something that even I as an adult still struggle with. I don't even wear v-neck shirts very often because I'm afraid of my cleavage to be out, because I didn't grow up in a place where my cleavage was like, like normal. I have lots of friends who didn't grow up in a religious experience, who love their bodies, who aren't ashamed of their bodies, who their parents honor their bodies and let them explore their bodies and let them dress in any way, and they're free and they're liberated, and that's beautiful, and that's how we all should be. There's nothing shameful about our bodies, and it's a lie that that we should be ashamed of our bodies. The shame I also feel is that as I became older, I really believed everything that I was being told, and I had a lot of judgmental thoughts about people who didn't think like me, act like me, believe what I believe. and I didn't treat them kindly. I cringe thinking about it now. You know, I I thought I was doing the right thing, you know, by creating boundaries and barriers and calling out people for their bad behaviors, I want me to do air quotes here, bad behaviors, what I deemed and what my church deemed as bad behavior. And it was wrong. It was judgmental. It was critical. It was not accepting of the person of who they are. It was a critical wound that I was delivering to somebody that they didn't deserve it. And it makes my heart hurt to think about it right now. The second thing in my religious wounding is this loss of self. Oh my gosh. I lost myself. I lost myself. I came into this world. I knew who I was. I was funky. I was mischievous. I was beautiful. I lost my beauty in the mix of it. I lost my self-confidence. I lost everything because all of the things I loved about myself as a child were things that the church didn't love about me. So I couldn't love those things about me either. And it has been a long journey to come back to myself and to look in the mirror and say, yes, you're beautiful. Yes, you have a beautiful body and you're allowed to show it off. Yes, you don't have to be small and shrink in the corner. Yeah, you can have your own opinions and you don't have to agree with everybody. So losing myself was a real thing, and I'm guessing it's probably a real thing for you too. And again, I don't want to bang down the sexual shame, but like the sexual shame is such a big component, and especially for women and men who experience it in a religious setting, because it colors and distorts your relationship with sex, like in a way that is so damaging. And I mean, I had to understand how my body even worked because I was never even told how my body works. I was never told what was supposed to happen when you had sex. I was never told what to expect when I had sex. And I wasn't also told that sex could have been pleasurable. Like that wasn't a thing. Sex was solely for procreation. And so there were so many confusing things happening in my 20s where I got married and I started to have feelings in my body, but I was told they were wrong. And so I couldn't be engaged in my relationship with my spouse at the time in the right way. And it's a shame. I didn't have anyone to talk about it with either because it was like unsaid. I mean, I even had friends at the time who went to their first gynecological appointment before they got married and didn't know what to expect, didn't know what they were going to do at a pap smear. Their parents didn't even tell them that. All of that stuff is so wrong, like so wrong. The body image, being told that your body is shameful is really hard to hear, and that you can bring men to lust. Like I felt like a freaking weapon out there. Like what is my body gonna do? Like I was like so scared. Like oh my god, and it's not even like a place of being sexually empowered. It's like I'm dangerous. I gotta keep this body under wraps because it's gonna bring some fire I'm not ready to bring with it. So I'm laughing and making fun now because I'm in a better place, but it's real to feel shame around your own body image and not even know how to be in your body because you've been told what your body was supposed to do, be, and present in the world. So please take a moment and think about any of these things that apply to you. And also write down any other religious wounding that is coming up for you. Pause this podcast, take a moment to check in with yourself and write anything that's coming up for you. The last piece is a self-agency thing, which is essentially loops back to the loss of self, which is tied to like being told what to think, believe, speak, embody, how to behave in all the world. Like when you're told, when you're indoctrinated by a religion, you're told to be a certain way, and you feel like you're at the mercy of your religion and your God. I remember thinking that, things would never work out for me because I was bad, or that, God didn't want this thing for me. But none of that was true. And I created all of these self-limiting beliefs from the beliefs that were being pushed onto me. And it was wrong. All of it was wrong. So losing my self-agency was really painful. And what I've loved about coming out of this religious experience is realizing how much power I have, how much agency I have over myself, how much liberation and freedom I have as a human being and as a woman on this earth. And nothing can stop me, and nothing can stop you at all. So again, take a pause. I'm going to take a quick sip of water and think about the religious wounding that came up for you while I was talking about this. The last thing, which is relating to the RTS, so the religious trauma syndrome, is there's new religious trauma. So I want to talk about this. Like, I left my religious experience, and my religious experience was isolated and isolated within my religious experience was also my friends, which was like one circle, one inner circle. Then there was like my family, and then the church was the outer circle. And my whole life existed in this big bubble of isolation. And leaving the church created a whole new set of religious trauma that I had no idea I was going to incur, or that was going to be a consequence. And the reason I bring this up, because it's so important that as you determine whether it's safe for you to stay in your own religious experience or to leave, that these are some things that you could experience. And in experiencing them, it will require additional support from people not in your friends and family and church community. So I want to talk about this for a second. The biggest thing is disappointing my family. My family is still disappointed, 100%. And they're scared for me. They believe when people leave the church, the Catholic Church, that those people are going to hell. I've had many people in my family, in my immediate and extended family, tell me that they're praying specifically for my soul that is no longer designated for the heaven line. So at the time when I left, the disappointing my family created a whole huge religious wound, because they loaded on the guilt. They isolated themselves from me. They got in fights with me. They judged me for leaving. They fought with me about stuff, about why did I leave and why didn't I believe. And what I realize now, and what I want you to be mindful of if you go through this experience, is that what they were feeling too in the disappointment was also me leaving was calling into question their own belief system as well. And that was scary, right? Because if I don't believe anymore, what does that mean for them? And also, where did they go wrong in my upbringing that I decided to leave? So there's those other variables that you have to think about when you're leaving your religion of origin. And it's not that you can just think about yourself. You have to think about how it's going to affect your family members and if they're ready to hear it. And sometimes it's safer to not actually say anything until you've found the right support systems, you've solidified what your new truth is, you've solidified your own safety. Like sometimes you have to physically leave your family's house and so find a way to financially support yourself or leave your, I don't know what that is for you, but you have to create a safe space for you to potentially give them the news after you've put yourself in a place of empowerment, of strength and resilience and support to be able to come back to your family and say to them that you no longer want to participate in this shared religious experience. I lost a lot of my friends in this process because they were religious, and then I became the cautionary tale, right? And that's hard. And then you have to make new friends, and making friends as an adult can sometimes be really challenging, right? And in the midst of losing friends and making new ones, I'm still at that point trying to figure out who I am and what I believe. I'm crying a lot during this time. I'm sad, I'm depressed. Never once, though, I will say this, did I question my decision. And I feel like when we get into the section about the inner healing, I'm going to talk a lot about our inner wisdom and our inner guidance system that really shows us the way and shows us whether we're in alignment or not with something. Once the fear subsides, once the guilt moves away, once you start to gain your agency back and you find yourself again, you realize you were on the right track, even if it didn't feel like that. And I never once questioned my decision. I knew it was the right thing to do. I just didn't know how hard it was going to be at the time, and it was definitely really challenging. And I'm grateful that I'm on the other side of it now, and I'm looking forward to you being on the other side. And I know that you can do it. And I'm sending you like super awesome, amazing, strong vibes right now as you try to navigate this, because it is challenging. What I felt too during that time, the new religious trauma that I was experiencing was like rejection and isolation, harsh judgment and being misunderstood, and conditional interactions and fear of people spending time with me. I started to become like a scarlet letter of sorts. I got isolated. I was rejected because that's what you're taught to do. You're taught in some of these shared religious experiences that if you're not in the confines of this religious organization, you're not safe. And so once you're outside of the circle of trust that they've created for themselves and anyone that can live there, then you're rejected and you're isolated and you're pushed aside. And in a way, that's the best thing that can happen, because you can't sort out for yourself what you believe and what you want your life to become and have one foot inside of that circle of trust and one foot outside of the world that you're trying to create for yourself. It won't work, and you'll eventually either be pulled back in or you'll march to your own drum and head out to the other way. So the isolation and rejection is super painful, and it is real, and it hurts. And people that you think are open and more progressive that are religious end up ostracizing you. That is so painful, and I'm here to listen to your pain because it was painful for me. Being misunderstood, I often talk about how once I was finding my way and finding my voice and reconnecting with myself, like I fucking felt like Julia Andrews in The Sound of Music, and I just like wanted to run across the hills and just like tell everyone like, oh my God, like this is amazing, like this other life of spirituality and awakening. And during my own journey, I read, all of the important spiritual and religious texts to see like, what do I believe? Like, and I even went atheist for a hot minute because I needed to understand, like, did I actually believe in a God or not? And when I shook out on the other end of my own clarity and my own integrity and my own belief system, I was like, I want to tell everybody about this. But nobody really wanted to listen to it, especially not in my circle of friends or my family that still talk to me. So there was a lot of misunderstanding, and I realize now that, this is why it's important for you to create support systems as you navigate this like interesting space of where you want to learn and become and change and grow. It's so important for you to start making friends with people who aren't a part of your religious shared experience, who have had similar experiences to leaving their religion of origin, or are just non-religious people who are open and accepting and tolerant and helpful, and then also getting professional help, because having an objective voice and sounding board is important in this process. And I think the heightened religious new trauma was finding out that love was really conditional in my immediate family, in my extended family, and in my friends, if I wasn't practicing what we all grew up to believe. And that's hard because you're taught your whole life that like your family should love you unconditionally and the people you love should love you unconditionally. And then you find out that actually you're only loved and appreciated if you believe what they believe. And that sucks. That was one of the hardest lessons for me to learn. And what I've learned on the opposite end of that is that I've shaken out as my daily practice is a Buddhist. I still believe in a higher power and higher intelligence that created us. I believe that I'm too small of a person and entity at this moment to know exactly what that thing is. And even God sounds like too small of a word to give it. And I'm open to know that I don't know what created us or what put us on here. But to that end, what I learned as a practicing Buddhist is that the tenets of Buddhism are really built around tolerance and compassion and acceptance and non-attachment and non-duality. And as I built my own integrity and my own belief systems in alignment with those tenets and started to practice compassion and tolerance and kindness and self-acceptance and regular acceptance for people, is that even though I was being shown even though I was being shown conditional love, that I still had to show up with unconditional love. And that although I was hoping that in growing my own tolerance, the people around me would also have tolerance for me, but I found out they didn't. Their love was conditional. Their tolerance had limits. Their acceptance had limits. And it was like you were on fire and they could only hold on to you for just a second and they didn't want to get burned. So in a way, and as you know, if you listen to the podcast, I'm a huge optimist and a believer in alchemy. So for me, that experience of bumping up against people's limitations and conditional love of me transmuted in me the ability to turn around and be like, I'm going to love you no matter what. And I forgive you. And I honor that you believe what you believe, and that's okay that we believe differently. But I'm not going to come to your doorstep and put conditions on how to be with me. And that's been such a beautiful lesson, and I've had to learn it over and over and over again. And there are still times where I find myself sort of riled up in the moment if somebody is presenting me with their conditions and their intolerance. But we're better than that. And part of going on this journey of releasing yourself and releasing the belief systems is finding a way to be more loving and kind to the world around you, and not putting limitations on the people around you, and having that non-attachment to outcomes, non-attachment to relationships and things like that. So those are my new religious traumas that I had to deal with on the opposite side of leaving my religion of origin. If you're in the middle of leaving, you might have already touched on some of these, and there might be some there that that are not listed. I encourage you to, again, pause for a moment, think about what is coming up for you in this, and write down what religious traumas you're incurring. And if you haven't left yet, please remember that there will be religious trauma, new religious and trauma incurred from severing that relationship. And that severing is real. The severing of your religious experience and everyone who's involved in it is real, and it can cause a lot of pain. So the new religious wounding, I kind of talked about all of these. I'm not going to go through this whole list, but I basically went through them on the last slide. They're all aligned with the traumas, essentially. So again, just write down what your wounding is and your trauma, and let's try to work through what that is for you. Okay, guys, we're towards the end of this episode. I super appreciate you sitting here with me and doing this with me. And I'm hoping that it's raising enough awareness in your mind to be able to address all these things. So, religious trauma and wounding reflection. Again, please have a journal with you during this experience. It's so necessary for you to process what's coming up while I'm talking about it against your own lived experience in religious organizations and your religion of origin and what trauma and wounding you had. So take a moment and list out your traumas, your wounding, your new trauma, and spend some time with it and figure out where you can insert some healing into those wounds. And we can talk about that more next week. And then how did the effects of this religious trauma manifest for you for the wounding? I listed kind of a list here for me. Shame and depression, sexual expression challenges, isolation, eating disorders, body shame, fear, low self-esteem, and low self-worth. Because when you're told, in your religious setting that your worth is only tied to your ability to be a woman against the backdrop of a man, and your life is just to a man, to your children, and to the church, you don't feel like you're worth very much when you are in that. And then when you leave it, you have to go and reevaluate your own worth for yourself. So think about what were the effects of the trauma and the wounding for you specifically. And again, this is not a comprehensive list. These are just the things that I experienced. So please, please, please sit with yourself in quiet and really figure out what came up for you. So I wanted to offer some recommended reading. There's these 4 books here. They might circulate again down the line in the week, but there's a really great book called Religious Trauma Syndrome: How I Survived My Religion, a Self-Help Guide When Leaving Your Religion by Prince Charles Clavius. And then the next book is Leaving the Fold, a guide for former fundamentalists and others leaving their religion by Marlene Winell. She's a PhD. Then we've got Sacred Wounds, A Path to Healing from Spiritual Trauma by Therese Pasquale, because I recognize also too that it might not just be religious trauma, there is spiritual trauma that can happen as well. Again, when institutions are ran by humans, it's not always ran in a way that is in a way that is free from harm of other people. So I want to recognize that this isn't just religions. This can happen in yogic ashrams. This can happen in Buddhist temples. Like, the wounding and the trauma is real, depending on the entry point, whether it was spiritual or religious. And then Glennon Doyle, who is amazing, just came out with a book called Untamed. And she talks about the religious wounding and trauma that she incurred too. I highly, highly recommend reading this, and the messages she received about being a woman, which is really critical. If you're a woman on this path in search of your true self, like, pick up her book, please. And then, as promised, these are the corresponding podcast episodes for religious trauma and wounding by episode. I'm not going to read all of these out for you guys, but please, please, please take a look at all of these episodes that I've recorded with all of these guests who have come to share their own religious background and experience, their trauma and their wounding, and the gamut here of like Baptist, Episcopalian, Mormon. Sarah was part of a religion I can't think of right now. Mike Dooley grew up Catholic. Christopher Moore didn't grow up Catholic, but he wrote this amazing book called Lamb. And he was raised by like a nanny that was Catholic that kind of had an influence on him. Sonia Benjamin grew up Christian, and Elena as well, Christian. So, so many good experiences to say like, me too. So thank you for being here with me today. I love holding space for you guys. I'm really grateful that I have a platform to be able to speak out about these things, and that you guys continue to listen to the podcast and subscribe. And you guys are so amazing. Your support's amazing. Please know that you can email me at ianwpodcast@gmail.com. Please follow the podcast on Instagram at ianwpodcast. And if you want to connect with me personally, you can find me on Facebook at Krista Ziomata. I do have my own personal Instagram as well. It is, my handle is I am Krista Ziomata. And send me your questions and anything else that you want to talk about in regards to this. I'm here. I've had so many people, like I said, the intention of this 8-week series was to consolidate my experience of leaving my religion of origin, getting healing, and then coming home to myself. Which if there's not anything you do in this life, it's the one thing you can do that would make the most sense to do is just to come home to yourself, to accept yourself unconditionally with love, and love all the parts of you, because we're all imperfect, but we're perfectly imperfect. So we've got to love the dark parts of ourselves as well as the light parts of ourselves. And I'm just here to hold your hand through it all and to walk with you guys through this experience. And I hope this helps at least one person, because I get so many messages on Instagram and through email about people, wanting support and wanting just to talk about like, how do I leave my religion of origin? So I'm so excited to be able to have this free course. It's 8 weeks. We're going to talk about so many things, and it's going to be your survival guide to get out of your religion of origin and into a space where you're living from a place of self-worth, self-agency, abundance, laughter, joy, all the things that you deserve. Every human being deserves to be living from a place of empowerment and liberation, no matter where you grew up, no matter what color of skin you have, no matter what your gender is, no matter what you identify as now. Like, you deserve to live a life full and um, without the anchor of your religious trauma and wounding. And it's real. And I want to just recognize the realness of what you've gone through. And I honor you in this moment for being here with me. Have a wonderful day, night, morning, evening, wherever you are, guys. And I will talk to you next week.